Financial planning and security can sometimes be seen as a moving target. The rules change constantly, and you need guidance to stay ahead of the market moves. This is the Lebenthal Report with industry veterans Michael Hartzman and Dominic Tavella. We'll break down the news, trends, and overall direction of the markets, telling you what may be coming next, investment opportunities, and what to avoid. Now, here are your hosts, Dominic Tavella and Michael Hartzman.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, and today is Tuesday, August 25th, 2026. And I'm on, as always, with my partner, Dominic Tavella. How are you, Dom?
Doing well, Mike. No complaints as we get to the last days of August here.
Yeah, hard to believe.
Hard to
Labor
believe. I
Day,
don't know where it went.
I was in CVS the other day, and the Halloween stuff is out, and pumpkin spice coffee is right around the corner, my friend.
Yeah, I'll pass. But thanks. Thanks for letting me know.
Thanks for the warning. So, through the week of August 21st, through the week of, last Friday, Dom, the Dow and the S&P, they're all down again. This little drip, 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 just kind of a sluggish August. The S&P was down 1.39. The Dow was down 0.78, 78 basis points. NASDAQ, as always seems to be the case, biggest winner, biggest loser, was down just over 2%. For the year, it remains healthy. Year to date, the S&P is up almost 13. The Dow is up almost 12. And the NASDAQ is up a little bit more than 13%. Again, as you always say, you told me that January 1st, that would be for the year. We would take it. But, you mentioned the dog days of August, and it just seems the market right now, not quite selling off, not quite, overly enthusiastic, but just seems to be meandering along towards the end of the month in the summer.
Yeah, I think, Mike, you're spot on with your commentary. I don't know if it's just the doldrums of summer or we don't seem to have a lot of direction right now. So one day it's up 0.25%, next day it's down 0.5%, and it's up. So we're kind of just swinging back and forth, very, very narrow channel. We are off the highs, but certainly, like you said, Mike, up 13% year to date. What do we got to complain about? So I think it's kind of normal for this time of year, a little sloshy. We are going into a period where it does get a little bit difficult. Volatility peaks up a little bit. But right now, so far, so good. So far, so good.
Yeah, what I'm encouraged by, Dominic, is there's not a lot of volume in the summer. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's less volume, less trading in the summertime because people are away, traders are away, investors are away. So it doesn't really take much to have a 600, 700,000 point down day. And I'm really happy we haven't had any of them. Just kind of the market, as I said, 0.5% here, 0.5% there, but nothing overly dramatic.
Yeah, and I have to say, Mike, because we pretty much haven't had anything dramatic in that the economic data we're getting is not terrible, but it's not great. The biggest issue, the war in the Middle East, is kind of on pause right now, without, thank God, too many missiles flying and people dying. And energy prices have eased off a little bit from their highs. So we're kind of in this wait and see period. And frankly, I'll take the pause and a deep breath while we all collect our thoughts and figure out how to proceed from here going forward.
So here's the loaded question. Wait and see what?
Well, and I'm going to point to the markets, not so much myself, but interest rates have been a little tough for the last month or so. We have the 10-year Treasury up over 4.6, almost approaching 4.7%. That's the high for the year, the high watermark. The 30-year Treasury is over 5%. Higher interest rates mean higher mortgage rates, mean higher credit card rates and car loan rates. So that's negative on the economy. going forward. But is it a temporary problem, Mike, because, oil prices and inflation, or is it something that becomes much more embedded and becomes a way bigger headache down the road? So we're kind of all wait and see mode. How bad is the situation going to get with inflation, or does it finally peak, roll over, and start coming down the balance of the year? So I think kind of wait and see is really the headline today. We don't know whether we don't have a crystal ball that works. We don't have a future that we can really hang our hat on right now. So no one wants to really be an aggressive buyer in these markets, and no one really wants to be an aggressive seller either. We're kind of tweaking around the edges.
And I agree with you. The bond market, which is typically a safe haven, the bond market is what's been a little cranky lately, and really dictating the direction of the stock market a little bit. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh yeah, listen, for the reasons I just outlined, if we got significantly higher interest rates, and we are right now at the higher end where we've been all year, that obviously has negative economic implications. People, the ability to buy a house, afford a house, people, the ability to afford a new car and financing it. So interest rates are really, really important here. And we had a little flutter last week where the government tried to I was going to use the word interfere, Mike. Maybe that's not the appropriate word.
Intervene.
Yeah, that's a better word. It's a more politically correct word. Intervene, trying to help the interest rate environment. I'm not sure. I know it didn't help and maybe even backfired a little bit. So higher interest rates could eventually be a big problem. Not yet. We'll see how it goes.
So let's touch on this. I've been you and I both been doing this long enough to know or remember that deficits, federal government deficits used to matter. I think the debt clock in Times Square is still up. And I think that went up during the Clinton administration. So last week we had a headline, Dom, and no one says trillion better than you, but the deficit hit $40 trillion. And other than the 1 day headline, I don't know, the stock market kind of
Yeah,
shrugged it off, didn't it?
you can understand if the average person on the street can't fathom that number, right? But Wall Street has no problems understanding that number. And then we could look at the $40 trillion, but then I focus on what does it cost us in interest payments every month, every quarter, every year? And in context, we now spend more on interest on financing the national debt than we do on national defense. So think
Mhm.
about every airplane, every aircraft carrier, every soldier, every sailor. The entire budget for defense is less than what we make in interest payments. And if you want to think about helping out the poor and the needy and paying for Medicaid and Social Security, think how much all those dollars would go to help that. But yet we just keep adding to the debt, and frankly, nobody seems to care. But as I've said lately, Mike, nobody seems to care until somebody cares, and then it will wallop us. So at this point, it's steady as she goes. But we've been talking about it for a long time, Mike. At some point, something's got to give.
Yeah. And 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 you look at the 10-year treasury from the beginning of the year, which you talked about earlier, that's gone up about a 0.5%, actually exactly 50 basis points. And the 30-year has gone up um, about 40 basis points. When you're talking about trillions of dollars, a 0.5% matters to the budget, right? I mean,
It matters in the totality of these interest payments that the government has to make on the
yeah.
borrowed money. But I'll take it just on a personal level, Mike. Think about all our clients who are buying a home or refinancing a home. Your 0.5% is exactly what a mortgage now costs more than it did the beginning of this year. So what's a 0.5%? In the big scheme of things, maybe not completely a earth mover, but it could be a couple of $100 per month for that mortgage holder. So it does affect the economy. It makes a difference.
It does, especially here on Long Island. We're buying a home for a young family is difficult in and of itself. And so what does that do? That now causes that new homeowner to maybe not sell their home, to hold off on selling their home. So all these things slow down the economy.
Slow down the economy. And again, I tie it back to mortgages, but think of a car loan. If it costs you 1% more on that car loan, a credit card that now costs you 1, 2, 3% more. And we can go on and on, right? So there is direct economic impact. And last comment, obviously a certain part of the population feels it more than the other part of the population. And in terms of companies, small, medium-sized companies are net borrowers. The big, large institutional companies, they don't borrow as much money, but the little guy does, and that really affects small businesses, hiring, new jobs. There's a real connection there, Mike.
And just to put a bow on it, Dominic, these interest rates are slowly creeping up without the Fed actually raising interest rates.
I'm glad you brought that up, Mike. We sit here day by day. What is the Fed going to do? Are they going to raise interest rates? We think they will. We think they won't. Interest rates are at least 0.5% higher today than they were on January 1st, and the Fed has not done anything in terms of raising interest rates. So that's a great point on your part, Mike.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So moving on, Dom, we have an interesting guest tonight. Her name is Professor Alexandra Natapov, and she edited a book with her colleague, Professor Guy Uriel Charles. They both are professors at Harvard Law School, and they got 62 Harvard law professors to write essays. And the book is titled America Unfinished, 250 Years of Law and Governance. And Professor Natapov is going to join us tonight to really talk about the motivation behind getting these 62 law professors to write their thoughts in 1,000-word essays about their various expertise that they teach to future lawyers of the country. So we will be right back with Professor Alexandra Natapov from the Harvard Law School.
You are listening to the Lebenthal Report. If you have any questions or comments, please send an email to contact@lebenthal.com. Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with my partner Dominic Tavella on the Lebenthal Report. And our guest this evening is Professor Alexandra Natapov from Harvard Law School. Good evening, Professor. How are you?
Good evening. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us. So when we got the opportunity to invite you onto the program, Dominic and I were fascinated by the idea that you had and you presented, my understanding is, to Professor Charles to on the country's 250th anniversary to get 62 of your colleagues to write a brief essay. I guess I'll let you describe the motivation and what the essays were about, but I guess the takeaway is you brought these 62 professors together to talk about their field of expertise, and I suppose how they felt the country was headed in one direction or another. Would that be correct?
So it's such an important moment. Obviously, it's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So even if everything were calm and unchanging and unremarkable in America today, it would be a moment for reflection on the state of our legal democracy. The idea, born 250 years ago, that we would create a republic based on the consent of the governed, which we don't always remember how radical an idea that was back in the day. Not the king, not the pope, just us deciding together. But of course, we are living in a moment of great change and conflict within our legal and governance structures. And Professor Charles, my co-editor, and I thought that it was an important and opportune moment, and maybe even a responsibility of us as scholars. We are so privileged to be legal scholars, to share our grappling, to share our work, to share the insights and the anxieties that we have in our respective areas of expertise. And so we reached out to our whole faculty. We reached out to the Harvard Law School faculty and said, this is a moment when we should be sharing and grappling out loud and trying to be in a more of a conversation with more stakeholders. And that's how this book came about. So over half the faculty said, yes, we agree. We would like to write and share. And so we got 62, as you said, 62 different essays from 62 different eminent legal scholars. My colleagues know a lot about each of their areas of expertise, essentially what each of them thought we should be thinking about right now, grappling with, worried about, building, understanding better.
So, Professor, just congratulations on getting 62 people to do anything, much less Harvard law professors. But I love the title Unfinished, because as a democracy, we are a work in progress. But what surprised you the most when you got these essays back?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the compliment, because there are not a lot of things that 62 Harvard law professors agree on at all. And so, frankly, we were thrilled that the majority of our faculty agreed that it was a moment to share the work and the expertise and the endeavors that we're all engaged in. I think it's fair to say that's where the agreement ended. And so when you take a look at the collection, you'll see that our colleagues do not agree. They don't agree on what the question is. They don't agree on what the problem is. They don't agree on what the solution is. The law is an enormous interconnected environment. And so the 62 different essays are really 62 different windows into what we might conceptualize as our legal governance, democratic infrastructure. Everything from corporate law to I should say, before the break, you were talking about our $40 trillion deficit. And we have a colleague, Professor Howell Jackson, who is a fiscal expert. He writes a chapter not just about the significance of the deficit, but the history of the deficit, the history of the budget process in American democracy and politics. And so it's not my area of expertise, and I learned an enormous amount from his analysis, from the analysis of so many of my colleagues. But the idea was each piece of this puzzle that is unfinished has an area of scholarship, of expertise around it. And my colleagues have thought about these questions literally for decades, collectively, probably hundreds of years of people hours thinking about these questions. So in a way, there's something in this collection for everybody.
Professor, when you gathered the essays with Professor Charles, was there at least a consensus, one way or the other, that there are problems still, large problems still to be dealt with in this country in terms of how people feel, whether the polarization in our politics or economic opportunities, or was the majority of the essays more like, yeah, we could tweak things, but we generally what we have is pretty good right now?
Yeah, that's a great way of asking the question. And Dom, I didn't quite answer your question directly about the title "America Unfinished." America is unfinished in some existential sense, because democracy is never unfinished. Is never finished. We're always passing it down to the next generation. We actually stole the title from the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln famously said during the Civil War in the address, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Of course, that was wrong. We've remembered it the whole time. But the rest of that sentence was, but the world will never forget what they, the soldiers, did here. It is for us, the living, to complete their unfinished work that they so nobly pursued here. And what he meant by their unfinished work is, as he says at the end of the address, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And it's hard to think of a moment more contested, more bloody, more troubled than the middle of the Civil War. So we are always unfinished, but sometimes we feel more unfinished than others. And these are not tweak essays. None of these essays are about small fixes around the edges. Each of these essays is, I would describe them each as a foundational analysis of one piece of the puzzle, whether it's corporate law, whether it's criminal law, which is my area of expertise, whether it's environmental law and the challenge of climate change, whether it's the state of the Supreme Court, its relationship to Congress. Of course, so some of the essays are about this moment in history, in particular, about the Trump administration and new policies that have come online that are different or particularly challenging or even damaging to legal norms and institutions and things that we actually may have taken for granted for a long time. But many of the essays are about phenomena that either predate or exceed any particular administration. These are long-term challenges that we have grappled with for a long time. And all of that is to say there are a lot of ways that America is unfinished. And we're law professors, right? So when you're a law professor, you tend to frame things in terms of law. Of course, not everything about our infrastructure is legal. Not all our challenges are of a legal nature, but law is inseparable from most of them. There's a legal frame, a legal component to the economy, to the environment, to our health, to inequality. And so the unfinished quality, we thought, was not only an apt description, but also, frankly, a challenge to us to share both what we think has been happening or the best way to understand each of these pieces of the puzzle, and then also to look forward and ask, what should we be doing?
So, Professor, I definitely want to get into some of the specifics of the thoughts of the professors, but I get it from my clients a lot where they just feel like this time it's different. Now, both myself and Mike have been involved in the financial services industry for 40 years, and as such, have been holding client hands for 40 years. But I guess the loaded question is this time different? Because it kind of feels like it's a little different this time.
Yeah. It's a thing we grapple with all the time. So let me answer your question in two ways, a sort of a large way and then a more specific way. So the large, one of the wonderful things about this collection is that there are half a dozen eminent historians on our faculty who have written to talk about how this moment is and is not different. My colleague Annette Gordon-Reed, prize-winning eminent scholar, talks about the history of what it means to be American. We're looking, of course, at a violent and high-profile immigration policy from this administration that feels to many people like it was different. And Professor Gordon-Reed locates that animus, that resistance to immigrants in our long history of battling over who gets to be an American. What does it mean to be of the people, we the people? My colleague Jill Lepore, who just happened to have won a Pulitzer Prize recently, she writes about the history of the war power and how even though the Constitution clearly and specifically vests the power to declare war in Congress, actually, since Vietnam, the president has either in effect or actually declared war many times, igniting a legal firestorm over whether the president actually has the authority to do that. And so she takes us through the story. What happened at Vietnam? What happened after? What's happening today? How is it the same? And how is today different? And so the historians, I think, keep us honest in a way. They remind us, we've been having these fights for a long time, but then they also help us see what is extreme or extraordinary about this moment. More specifically, so the essay that I wrote for this essay collection is about this moment in our criminal system, and I have been working in and around our criminal system, for a couple of decades now. And on the one hand, there are some very different things happening in our criminal system. Presidential pardons are, for all intents and purposes, for sale on the open market. That's different. That has not happened in the history of modern. We're not talking about feudalism or when the king is in charge. We're talking about modern American criminal history. That hasn't happened. The open embrace, the Department of Justice's open embrace of blatantly politicized and rewarding and retributive prosecutions. It's not, so there's a story about the American criminal system that it's all political, right? So nobody's arguing that there are no politics in criminal law. That would be silly. But the open embrace of it, that's different. To not hide the ball, to not apologize, to say that's not what we're really doing, just to say, yeah, this is what we're doing. That's different. And I think a lot of the essays from my colleagues are like this. On the one hand, they say, here are the roots. Here are the similarities. Here is where these things come from. And then here is where this moment might be different. One thing, you asked me what surprised me. It didn't surprise me in terms of information, but I think the collection of essays around these various topics are really eye-opening. Around technology. Today's technology raises issues that we have just never had to grapple with. Artificial intelligence. I work in the knowledge industry. It raises the question, what is human knowledge? Can it be distinguished from the kinds of work that AI does? What does it mean to be a lawyer? What does it mean to teach law in a moment when the nature of human knowledge itself and legal knowledge is being contested? My colleague, Professor Zittrain, who is he's a professor at the law school. He's also a professor in the computer science department. So he has his expertise in many different arenas. And he says it's not just AI. AI is the extreme and dramatic expression of the moment, but it was true for the internet. It was true for all kinds of developments in technology that changed information, knowledge, music, the ability to share information. We're always going through these challenging tectonic shifts. And so again, extreme and different, and yet also not out of the blue, not magic, not all of a sudden, but every piece of this puzzle has come from some place. And I myself have learned an enormous amount about the roots of so many things that seem extraordinary today.
Professor, we also deal with the AI revolution, and at the end of the day, I think most clients still want our opinion, our advice, and the relationship that we have with clients because we understand their goals and their motivations. As I think about what you said about the legal profession, um, lawyers write opinions and judges write opinions. I apologize about a case, and yes, AI could help, but isn't it an opinion from a judge, from the heart and from the head, and while they're interpreting the law, I mean, isn't it inevitable that their own feeling and belief system comes into play when they write that opinion that AI can't do?
Yeah, so you just pressed a button that has generated volumes and volumes of debate and philosophy.
And the next book.
In the we'll co-author it. And the question of what should justice look like? What do we think about the fact that individual judges leave their mark, their decisional mark on law? Is that bias, or is that exactly what we want? Do we want human beings to be deciding the fate, the lives, the destiny, the financial futures of human beings? It's one of the great challenges of law in my world, in criminal law. Who gets to decide what is right or wrong? And law is one of the foundational collective ways that we as a society come together through our legislatures, that's where law comes from, interpreted by our judiciary, that's where cases come from, to constantly, in an unfinished way, always reiterating, to constantly debate this question of who gets to decide. It is not a simple question. And now the addition of AI to intervene in that ancient question, thousands of years old, about who gets to decide what is just and what is law, is shaking up that world even more. But in many of these essays, the legal scholars, so there's a whole section on legal theory for the philosophers in the audience, grappling with the nature of how law lets us work together to create norms, values, and community. And AI is really disrupting and shaking up that whole conversation.
Let's stop right there, and we'll give Dom a few minutes to formulate his next question and for you to catch your breath. So let's take a break with Professor Nanopov from Harvard Law and the editor of the new book, America Unfinished.
You are listening to the Lebenthal Report. If you have any questions or comments, please send an email to contact@lebenthal.com. Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with my partner Dominic Tavella on the Lebenthal Report. And our guest this evening is Professor Alexandra Natapov. She co-edited a book called America Unfinished with Professor Guy Uriel Charles, both of Harvard Law. Welcome back, Professor. Dom, I think you're up.
Thanks, Mike. So just kind of curious, Professor, I mean, almost on a daily basis, we're seeing some kind of law passed or challenged in court, only to have a judge rule. And that, I think before the ruling even comes out, it's brought to a higher court and then reversed. And then it's brought to another court, another district in another part of the country with a different judge, ultimately ending up in the Supreme Court, only to do the whole thing all over again. As a professor, as a law professor, your colleagues, are you frustrated by all this? Is it challenging to wrap your head around different judges making different rulings on the same issues? How do you guys deal with it? How do you explain it?
So in regular life, this is what happens every day, just more calmly and slower. In a way, you're asking me, how is rule of law supposed to work? How is our legal system supposed to resolve conflict? Rule of law, of course, is the great alternative to violence. We have other ways of resolving conflict, but rule of law gives us an infrastructure through which we create mechanisms where different people, different institutions, different stakeholders can weigh in on the question of how to resolve conflict. I want one thing, you want something different. In this, and in this particular case, rule of law is a little, the challenges of rule of law today, I think, are on steroids. As you describe, things are going faster, things are being broken, the seams of the system are being stretched to their extreme. And anytime you put pressure on a system that way, you see its flaws, you see its compromise that we might have lived with previously, we might have skimmed over them, but today they're really on display. I'll just flag a couple of essays in the book deal with this challenge when it comes to the Supreme Court. And so at the end of the day, of course, the Supreme Court is the highest tribunal in the land, and its job is ultimately to bring closure to these conflicts. And of course, there's enormous controversy around this Supreme Court, around the perception that it is politicized, that it is not neutral, or that it is exercising its authority in a way that is not consistent with its role as the neutral guarantor of rule of law. And there are two essays in this collection that I would recommend to you and to your listeners, both about the Supreme Court. There's a section in the book. There are 15 different sections in the collection, and one of them is about the Supreme Court. And these two essays are both by luminous, experienced constitutional law scholars, and they are the polar opposite positions on this question that you asked me: is everything okay with our judicial system? And one essay argues that the Supreme Court has abused its judicial authority, that judicial supremacy is anti-democratic, and we are seeing the seams in that compromise, and that the democratically elected legislature, the Congress, the state legislatures, they should be, at the end of the day, the last word on what the law is. And so the argument of the essay is that the Supreme Court should be changed. It should be revised. The rules should be revised. Maybe its composition should be changed because it has stepped beyond the bounds of its legitimate authority. The companion essay also by another luminous constitutional law scholar, takes the exact opposite position and says, this is exactly how the federal judiciary is supposed to work. when incendiary issues are at stake. Of course, you're going to get different decisions at lower courts. Of course, they're going to be appealed. Of course, they're going to end up in different ways, in different postures before the Supreme Court. That is exactly how rule of law is supposed to work. And the more incendiary the problem, the more lit up the system is going to be. And if we mess with it, if we mess with the Supreme Court, we run the risk of destabilizing rule of law. And so whatever your take on the Supreme Court is, whatever your view is, I think these two essays, and then so many pairs of essays like this throughout the collection, really illuminate these are the problems, these are the deep questions that arise. And then, of course, we can all have our own take on how it should come out.
That was a great question, Dom, and great answer, Professor. Thank you. Professor, if I was thinking as you were speaking, and Dom mentioned earlier how clients and people in general just tend to be nostalgic. So if this book was written 50 years ago, the 200th anniversary, 15 years prior to 1976, we dealt with the Civil Rights Act. The women were fighting for more rights. Abortion became illegal in 1973. Vietnam. The only thing I remember about the 60s was the Mets won the World Series and there was a man on the moon. But a lot of stuff went on. How do you think the law professors 50 years ago would have treated their essays? Would they treat them any differently then as they've treated them now? There's maybe no way of knowing that. So I'm just looking for your opinion on that.
Yeah, I love that question. So I should say Harvard Law School has never done anything like this before. So they didn't do it 50 years ago. And Harvard Law School has been around for 200 years. So it wasn't that there haven't been opportunities to weigh in. But I think you're putting your finger on the relationship between, on the one hand, this dynamic, unfinished, cyclical nature of democracy by design, because not only do we hand down our democracy and our legal infrastructure every single generation, but we have built-in mechanisms for change. Every election, every institution, we're built for change. And so there is, as I say, sort of an existential quality of unfinishedness, of change baked into having a democracy, because it's not the monarch deciding. You could imagine people wondering, well, would everything be more stable if we just had a king or a queen? So stability is not the only metric of success. Sometimes we want change, and then we celebrate the mechanism that gives it to us or that makes it possible. Again, if we understand rule of law and democratic rule of law, meaning the consent of the governed, as Abraham Lincoln put it, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as an opportunity for actual Americans to weigh in on what they would like to be different, then we should anticipate change. And so 50 years ago, we were seeing great change, social and cultural, as well as legal change. And one of the stories about today is that some of those changes are being reversed. And depending on which side of the street you live on, you might say they're being destroyed, they're being undermined, we're being set back. And others might say, no, they're being revised. They're being or put back. For folks who thought 50 years ago, some of the changes went too far or were inconsistent with what they would have liked to see. And so, again, to go to my own area of expertise, criminal law. So our criminal system looks very, very different today than it did 50 years ago. And so some questions that don't even make sense. A much larger percentage of our population has now been touched by the criminal system than 50 years ago. it was not the case 50 years ago that the United States was engaged in mass incarceration, and we didn't lock up a greater percentage of our population than any other country or all of Western Europe combined. It just wasn't true. And so there are some things that have changed, and so the questions of upheaval are different, and yet a lot is the same. A lot is the same today as it was 50 years ago in the criminal system. It is still the case that the criminal system works pretty well for the well-connected and the well-resourced and the powerful. That mechanism had rule of law, the benefits of rule of law and constitutional rights and being respected by the tribunals have always been available to the well-heeled. And the criminal system has really never worked very well for ordinary Americans. We talked a little bit about inequality at the beginning of the show. And our criminal system is one of the places where we see rampant inequality on display in the way different people are treated by police, in jails, by judges, by the system. And that was true 50 years ago, and it's true today, even though many aspects of our criminal system are unrecognizable from 50 years ago. So again, to have these challenges in historical perspective is not a way of throwing up our hands and saying, oh, well, it's always like this. But hopefully it is a way to not repeat the mistakes of the past.
Professor, if you allow me one comment and then one question. Thanks for sharing the story about the two professors arguing about the Supreme Court with polar opposite opinions, because sometimes I'm watching TV and my head spins. How can two people share a discussion on the same exact topic and be so completely polar opposite in their opinion? So I think that's normal, right? You're supposed to have different opinions and hopefully compromise. And then on the question of criminal activity, we're dealing with AI today. We've never had to deal with an entity. I'm going to call it an entity. You're welcome to call it something else if you like. And we just had a case where this entity broke out of a supposedly secure box and then hacked a corporate company, got into its systems and hacked it. Who's criminally responsible, and how do you prosecute them, and how we write laws for this? Because I think at the end, this is what it comes down to.
Let me just go back to your comment about two radically opposing views on the same question, which in a way, it's both of the heart of law and the spirit of democracy. The idea of free speech is that there could be polar opposite views. I don't get to tell you what to think, and you don't get to tell me what to think. And then through our legal infrastructure, we're going to create a society in which you and I can coexist with our differences. And without that, we wouldn't really call it a democracy if we all had to take the same position. And of course, then we wouldn't need elections, and we wouldn't need law. We wouldn't need to resolve disputes. And we're just starting up classes here at Harvard Law School this week. And you just expressed the surprise, and I want to call it a little bit of an anxiety that our students are expressing, which is, how can both things be true? How am I supposed to master two diametrically opposed points of view? And the answer is, welcome to law school. And so it's that skill of seeing both sides. It doesn't mean you are giving up your values, your moral core, your position, but to be able to see and understand the other side, that in many ways is a prerequisite for meaningful democratic conversation. Before I get to your question about AI, there's a wonderful—
Professor, again, stressing, that's comforting to me that we can have intelligent conversations and disagree, because so much of that is lost in today's world, right?
I think that there's a whole section on free speech and dissent, and a combination of historians and litigators and theorists all writing about different aspects, both of the history of free speech and dissent as a foundation of our democracy, where it's wearing thin, how it's being challenged today, and how we might understand the need to preserve it. There's also a wonderful essay by my colleague, Dr. Sheila Heen. She is maybe one of the world's leading experts on negotiation. And her essay is called Democracy is a Negotiation. And she points out every election is a negotiation. Every bit of legislation, these legislatures have to persuade other legislatures to vote for it. In town hall meetings, judges have to persuade each other. We're always negotiating. The day we stop negotiating, we will stop calling this a democracy. And so we're all invested and committed to, and of course, worried every time we see a threat to the ability to converse across difference in a meaningful way. You can feel the foundations just shudder a little bit. And of course, AI is relevant to that, to the destruction of conversation as we offload our thinking and our conversations to, you called it an entity, that's fine with me, I don't know what to call it. And you asked, how are we going to, so in criminal law, how are we going to handle the bot that breaks out and does terrible things? And it seems impossible. It seems like science fiction. It seems like we have no tools to deal with it until we think back about the actual infrastructure of criminal law. Criminal law has many tools to deal with agency. That's just a fancy word for I told you to do that and then you went and did it. Well, we have criminal rules about the kinds of things that I can be held criminally liable for if I get you to go do things. We have criminal laws about, sometimes we call them conspiracy or aiding and abetting, sometimes we call them group crimes. What if we do it together? What if I'm home while you rob the bank? What if I'm home while the bot goes and does something? We have principles, ancient principles about collective liability, about what we call vicarious liability. Can I be held liable for a thing that you did? And of course, with technology, whether it's a car or something on the internet or a gun, all kinds of technology. Every time those new pieces of technology have shown up, the criminal law has asked, okay, how do we deal with this? So it's not quite right to say that we don't have the tools. Actually, we have a lot of tools. Part of lawmaking and part of democratic lawmaking is asking, how do we want to use our existing tools, our existing legal and democratic and governance infrastructure to deal with AI, to deal with climate change, to deal with, one of my colleagues writes about these, and it sounds like science fiction, these new reproductive technologies with gene splicing and cell exchanges where we can make new life out of cells from one individual. Well, we don't have, and the essay is about the vacuum that the Supreme Court has left. It has not spoken to these questions, but we have principles. We have hundreds of years of principles about bodily autonomy, about due process, about liberty, about privacy that we can bring to bear. So all of that is to say, one of the really powerful things about law is that it is also forward-looking. But we need a democratic infrastructure to make sure that the laws that we create for the new emergencies, for the new technologies, for the new situations, work for us, not just for the powerful, not just for the strongest stakeholder, not just for the person with the biggest stick, but for as many Americans as possible.
Professor, I wish we had another hour because I have so many more questions to ask you, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. And I truly enjoy this conversation I don't even know, Dom, if you know this, as a senior in high school in Brooklyn, I actually did an internship at the Brooklyn DA's office under DA Eugene Gold. And I thought for sure I was going to be an attorney. And spending those 6 months at the Brooklyn DA's office convinced me not to go to law school, because I had an experience in the criminal justice system, which seemed so chaotic to me. I decided to pursue a different career. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I think we want to give you an opportunity, Professor, to promote the book and where our guests and listeners and viewers can hopefully find it.
So it came out on July 4th, appropriately. It is published by MIT Press. You can get it at any local bookstore, online, of course, in the usual places. There is a page on the Harvard Law School website with videos and extra materials for people who are interested. You can see little vignette interviews with many of the authors, not just me, but a lot of the contributors. And for any of the educators in your listenership, I'll just flag, in 2027, MIT Press, we're thrilled and grateful, has agreed to make the book open access, which means any educator who wants to assign it, their students will not have to pay. Anybody who wants to read it, who doesn't have 26 bucks, will have access to it. And we really think that that's the spirit of the conversation. We all need to be in it. We need to be having this conversation across all kinds of tables.
Well, Professor, thank you.
Professor, will be one on the list to get it. I think it'll be fascinating reading. I hope a lot of people, even if they don't read it cover to cover, I bet you they're going to find paragraphs, stories, outlines in there that they're going to find interesting in their own personal lives. So I hope people go out and get it.
It's kind of a cookbook. You don't read a cookbook from beginning to end. You go to the part that you're interested in, and there are 62 different recipes in here. I think there's something for everybody.
Thank you.
Well, Professor, thank you again for joining us, and thank you to Professor Charles. I know he couldn't be with us tonight. And Dominic and I will be back next week with a new edition of the Lebenthal Report. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, all.
Thanks for tuning in to the Lebenthal Report. Dominic and Michael will be back for our next program, airing next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Pacific Time and 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Business Channel. Until then, have a great week. The Lebenthal Report is brought to you by Lebenthal Global Advisors, LLC, a registered investment advisor, and Lebenthal Financial Services, Incorporated, a FINRA-registered broker-dealer. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. The views expressed are subject to change based on market conditions. For more information about our qualifications and business practices, visit our website, lebenthal.com, where you'll find links to SEC's and FINRA's official resources.